Former President of Israel's Supreme Court, Justice Aharon Barack, thank you for joining us on I-24 News.
Thank you for having me.
Justice Barack, I'm sure, of course, many people are more familiar with your years on the bench than your extensive legal career even before that. So maybe just briefly explain what about the key role you played there at the Camp David talks as a legal advisor, and how it brought you into close contact with former President Jimmy Carter.
Well, the architect of the Camp David agreement was Jimmy Carter. Of course, an agreement could not be reached without the consent of Sadat and Begin, but the event couldn't take place, and no agreement could be reached without the active participation and efforts of President Carter, from the first day at Camp David to the last day.
And what about your personal interactions with him as the legal advisor? Reportedly, he was so taken with you, he offered you he said you would like to see you on the U.S. Supreme Court. On the other hand, accounts of some tense moments in the negotiations.
Well, there were two parts of the negotiation. One was the negotiation at Camp David. The other part was the negotiation at Washington. The first negotiation was about the comprehensive agreement in the Middle East, which included one part, guidelines to an agreement with Egypt, and the second part, guidelines to a proposal of a solution for peace with the Palestinians. The second part is the negotiations which took place at the Madison Hotel in Washington, and this took place, was about the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. In both parts, the major role was played by President Carter.
Mm-hmm. And what did you make of Jimmy Carter, a man who was, on one hand, certainly deeply religious, so much so that he could have pursued a career as a pastor, but also a man deeply immersed in politics?
Well, I think President Carter was very much involved in the negotiations. He knew every detail. In the first part, he even, when I was sitting with him, he drafted proposals. And I was argued with him, please, Mr. President, this is not the legal text we need. And then he said, so, okay, so what should we change? So we had to negotiate about it. But his main aim was to reach a peace. His views about the Israeli-Arab conflict, his views about the law and religion, all this were put aside because he wanted to have peace between Israel and the main force who was against it, which was Egypt, Sadat. And so without Carter, we would not have a peace agreement. Neither the first part, namely the comprehensive peace agreement, guidelines for the Middle East, neither the second part dealing with the agreement peace agreement between Israel and Egypt.
Right. A lot has been written about the personal relationship that developed between him and President Sadat and, of course, Prime Minister Menachem Begin. You were a witness to that up close. What did you make of, especially the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin?
Well, of course, when you are 13 days in Camp David, you have enough time to create personal relationship. Both Sadat and Begin were situated in different cottages, and they almost, after the first 2-3 days, they almost didn't meet until the end. The negotiations was in the beginning, in the first 3 days with them, Carter, Begin, Sadat, no agreement was reached. Then the second part were negotiations between the delegations, between the U.S. delegation and Israel, and the U.S. delegation and the Egyptian delegation. not between Israel and Egypt. The third part, and the one which I was involved very much, I participated in the second part too, but in the third part, Carter asked Sadat and Begin to appoint a representative with whom he will negotiate, and any agreement reached between him and the representatives will be submitted to the delegations for approval. And so the Egyptian delegations sent Osama El-Baz, and the Israeli delegation, on the request of President Carter, sent me. So I was sitting in the last 3 or 4 days with President Carter and Osama El-Baz, and the three of us were sitting and discussing the different texts, and slowly, with the major pressure of Jimmy Carter, not just, of course, as a human being, but as the President of the United States, slowly, we reached an agreement.
But I want to come back to your relationship. Why did Jimmy Carter suggest you and not a diplomat? There seems to have been some kind of, I want to say, chemistry between you. He certainly had great respect for you. How did you feel about him?
Well, he asked me because I went with Begin to his first meeting at the White House before Camp David. So also before Camp David, there were meetings between Begin and President Carter, when Prime Minister Begin presented to President Carter the autonomy piece, or the autonomy agreement that he drafted, that Begin drafted. And when I went with him to Carter, in fact, the one who was making the talking, who explained the autonomy agreement, was myself, because I drafted it for Prime Minister Begin. When I'm saying I drafted it, it doesn't mean that it was my ideas. It were my ideas, not at all. The political side, he drafted 15 points, which were his political agreements. He asked me to make a legal agreement out of it, which I have done. And so he knew me since then, and we met several times since then. And he knew that I will do whatever a lawyer can do in order to fulfill the legitimate wishes of his delegation. And so he trusted me very much. Even if he would not ask Begin to send me as a representative of our delegation, Begin would do it by himself, because Begin knew very well the close, so to speak, relationship between me and President Carter.
Right. And I wonder if did this relationship continue after Camp David? And I'm asking that on a personal level just, but also because how Israel viewed Jimmy Carter seemed to change in the years after Camp David, when many Israelis felt he was being unfairly harsh on Israel and writing books like Peace, Not Apartheid.
Well, I met President Carter after Camp David, of course. I met him in the second part, which I mentioned, which was in the Madison Hotel in Washington. But I met him several times later, whether he was first time when he was a president, and then also when he was not the president of the United States. He came to visit, and he called me, and we talked. His views on the Israeli-Arab conflict were represented in his attempt to solve the problem in Camp David, as I mentioned. His book about Israel as apartheid, I think, was a mistake. I told him so. Israel was not and is not an apartheid state. But at our last meeting in Camp David, he told me that he is going to write a book about his memories, his memoir, what happened in Camp David. In fact, I told him that I would like to write also something about the legislative history of Camp David. And he said, yes, whatever I have, I'll give it to you. Well, he has done it, his share. I haven't done my share. So maybe a time will come, I will come back to it, and I hope that in his library I will have an access to all the documents.
Well, let me give you a chance. Let me give you a chance for a brief assessment. How should Israelis or supporters of Israel in total view Jimmy Carter, taking into account the entirety of his life and his relations with Israel in the Middle East?
Well, I think it was a complicated relationship. He supported very much the rights of the Palestinians for a state of themselves. This was his view, and he hasn't changed it, I think. But on the other hand, he was a realpolitik, and he understood that what can be reached, is an agreement with Egypt, which is of major importance. Egypt was our main enemy, and to reach an agreement with Egypt was a major event. And this agreement stands still now too. So for him, I think the agreement was important, but the fact that he has made this agreement to happen did not change his views about the Israeli-Arab conflict. I think he would like to have another agreement, but it was impossible at that time. I'm not sure if it's possible today, but the second Camp David was regrettable, not successful. And so, as I mentioned, I think his relationship with Israel is a complicated relationship, I think. And therefore, the Jews all over the world will have a complicated relationship with him. On the one hand, some of them wouldn't agree with his views about Israel, etc. But I think all of them should understand the major role he played. He is the architecture of the agreement in Camp David, with the agreement with Egypt, with peace between Israel and Egypt. Later, of course, it continued with peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, and with the Abraham Accords between Israel and other Arab states.